Ahoy there, me hearties! Welcome to this DungeonFog tutorial video, where we're looking at pirate ships, of course. What else are you going to be looking at? Right, well, there we got ourselves a nice fine little ship behind us. Not a very big ship, mind you, but a ship that's very worthwhile in terms of sailing. Well, yes, this is a sailing ship, and it's an 8-gun ship, so not particularly large, possibly a sloop or maybe a small bark. Certainly not a 6th-rate ship of the line, nothing as fancy as that, but we're talking pirate ships. Now, why particularly? It doesn't have to be pirate ships, of course, it can just be any ship, really. But what's important about designing ships, in my opinion anyway, when you are designing them, what's important to keep in mind? Well, there are a few little things here and there that I think are important. Now, whether it's cannons or ballista, whether it's a mage hurling fireballs, or whether it's a starship for that matter, the idea behind a sailing vessel, behind a vessel in particular, it pretty much is the same thing. You've got PCs on this ship. You've got PCs on this space. What are they going to be able to be doing? How big is that space? And how much do you need to really put into that space to make it feel real? So I have designed this ship. Obviously, we are in DungeonFog, and I'll be taking you through the various levels. We have 4 decks in total. I'm going to pop those out here. Let's try and get rid of some of that nonsense. We've got 4 decks, the upper deck, the weather deck, the mid deck, or the all-up deck as it's sometimes called, and then we have the hold as well. So we've got those 4 different layers that we're going to just work our way through and talk about them as we need to. So when we look at the upper deck, this is usually where steering happens. There's a chaser cannon at the back here. That's literally because a ship chasing you, you can now fire a blast off at them. These were not very big cannons, generally speaking. They were more designed to puncture your enemy's sails than doing actual damage to the ship, so that your enemy basically had to slow down and you could get away. Not often very common because space on a ship is at a premium. Generally speaking, ships are designed for 2 purposes. Either it's hunting down the enemy, in which case they're built for speed and damage, or they're there for cargo, in which case then everything is given over to cargo because that's where the money is. So with this particular ship, we've got our upper deck, which is basically these 2 areas that you can see here. The forecastle or the forecastle. I've always been told it's pronounced forecastle, even though it's spelt forecastle. And then the aftcastle, which isn't pronounced aftcastle for whatever reason. Anyway, the aftcastle is where generally helm would sit. I've got a little table here with a little gun on it and a book. Again, a lot of combat is going to happen here, so I didn't want it to be too cluttered, too busy with stuff. Combat will happen here. Each of these squares on the grid behind me that you can see, each of these squares is 5 foot, so you haven't got a huge amount of space. You've got maybe a 16-foot square block in which to play. These, by the way, are not barrels, these are masts. I just put them there as holders to remind myself, oh yeah, these are the actual masts themselves. And you can see very faintly I've got the actual sails there just to remind the players where these sails might sit. You don't really need to worry too much about rigging. I certainly have never done so. If they climb into the rigging, it's an acrobatics check or a skill check of some kind to represent that. The forecastle, the fore section of the ship, of course, is something that you're going to, again, have lots of combat in, somewhere that you can have lots of space to do so. And then, because it's not just a sailing ship, generally speaking, you will only map out, and this is a question that I have been asked a lot, generally speaking, you will map out only vessels that the characters are likely to interact with over an extended period of time, over an extended period of time. It becomes important for the characters to know where they are and to have a sense of ownership of that space. Then you design and lay out a ship. If they're just attacking a Star Destroyer, by no means do you need to design all 127 stories of that mega structure for them to occasionally run down a passageway. That's too much. Unless you really, really like battle maps, Theatre of the Mind will suffice for most ships and for most, well, encounters on those ships. When you want the PCs to fall in love with the structure, when you want them to feel like they own this ship, that's when you then go into detail. Why? Because it allows them to start looking at stuff and to start manipulating and doing things to this ship to make it feel more like their own. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we get further down into the actual ship itself. So upper deck, generally speaking, you want it to be nice and clear because that's usually where a lot of combat's going to be. Creatures such as our friendly little Kraken over there might attack the ship. You might have other ships pulling alongside, in which case you've got people dropping down onto these decks. So this is where a lot of combat's going to happen. So you're going to make this space as big as possible and less and as little clutter as possible if you are going to use it as a battle map. Okay, so let's head down now onto the actual main deck itself, the weather deck, often called the weather deck because, well, it's exposed to the weather, isn't it? I mean, that's pretty straightforward. So this is the actual weather deck here, this little brown section. The darker brown sections, and I'm just looking at my recording there, the darker brown sections are actually undercover, and sometimes they're called the quarterdeck. This is basically because they're quarter of the deck. A quarter of the deck is under roof, this quarter of the deck is under roof, and this half of the deck supposedly is exposed and open. Again, the exposed area we don't want to have too cluttered. So I've got basically all of the sides are nice and open. I do have a plank because, well, let's face it, it's a pirate ship and you got to walk the plank. So you're going to walk the plank. Then, of course, stair access. Now, this is something that people often tend to forget about, especially when they're designing sailing ships, but also when they're designing starships. Accessibility is of absolute paramount importance. And the reason for it is not just so that you can allow the PCs to sneak up one staircase whilst the enemy is sneaking down the other. It's because these are vessels that are designed to function. If you make it too restrictive in terms of how you can move around your ship, if the ship were to strike an iceberg, for example, and start to sink, they need to be able to respond quickly. So part of the design ethos might need to take into account actual practical values. And the easiest way to do that when designing your own sailing ships is to go and find deck plans on Google and say just how big are these ships, how wide are these ships. This ship, for example, is very, very wide in comparison to her length. So she's not going to be very, very fast under the amount of sail that she can put out, but she is going to be nice and stable. So that means she can, you know, handle things quite well, but just not be very, very, very fast. That's an aside. That's purely academic. You as the creator obviously can have this ship move at whatever speed you like. So the weather deck itself is nice and exposed. Because the ship is, in this case, it was originally a transport ship, which has now been translated into a weapons ship. It's got these two, I can't get there, my finger's going to get cut off. It's got those two big grates. Those grates lead down into the deck below, allowing them to add cargo. Now, this is an important consideration. Sailing ships, pretty much up until the 1940s, how scary is that? Sailing ships, when they were loading cargo, it was loaded haphazardly. It was put into wooden boxes that were capable of being lifted, generally speaking, by human beings. Yes, they had cranes to lower in big pallets of stuff, but individual boxes were usually designed so they could be lifted by individuals. Several individuals, perhaps, but by individuals. And there was a reason for that. Getting into the hold of the ship was usually quite tricky, and there wasn't really a formalized system. If you had cargo that you needed transported, you dropped it off of the harbor, they put it into the ship somewhere, and off it went. So it was very haphazard. Only once we invented cargo containers did ships suddenly start getting packed in a very formal way, and balancing started to become a major thing. And of course, a cargo container has a crane which can now lift in and out and those sorts of things. It does bring its own design problems, but generally speaking, hatches were the only way that you could get into the bottom of the ship. So you've got to include some hatches. In a starship, on the other hand, you need bay doors. Now, you need to have those doors open and big enough and wide enough to be able to take things in. And if you like, leave the comment below and let me know. We can talk about designing starships that are going to have hangars that are capable of launching out little fighters and things like that. And how do they change your overall design? It's important to think about those kinds of things. You can't just sort of go, oh, well, you can launch 60 fighters at once. Can you? Can you really? Do your cargo bay doors open that wide? I don't think so. So those are the kinds of things that start coming in when we're talking maps on that sort of space, no pun intended. I wanted the entrance to the quarterdeck to be quite dramatic, so that's why I put in these double doors. Now, in retrospect, the double doors in the forward section of the ship may not necessarily be the best course of action, but the double doors at the back here certainly make for a more interesting entrance to the various areas. So we've got the captain's quarters here at the back. Usually they had nice windows, they had nice views looking out. If you look at the back of old sailing ships, oftentimes there was a row of windows that were the most prestigious cabins, the cabins where the most most prestigious people stayed, and that's usually the captain, maybe the first officer, generally not more than that. Remember, the ship is not designed to be comfortable for the sailors, it's designed to take cargo or to hunt down the enemy. So in either case, it's not usually a huge space, although in this case it is a 10 foot by 20 foot room, which in ship terms is very, very big. Obviously, on bigger ships, those rooms got bigger and bigger until ultimately on the most prestigious battleships, those rooms would be lavishly large so as to allow for the prestige and power of the captain to be reflected in that space. Again, it's all about size. The more power you have, the bigger it has to be to show everyone that you have more power. It's just how it works. So we've got this captain's cabin. Now, the captain is a bit of a gregarious individual on board the ship, so he has a bathroom. He actually has a bathtub. And you can see my mouse. He has a bathtub just in the corner of the room. And then in the other room here is the first officer's room. They've got beds, by the way. They don't have hammocks. They actually have physical beds. Then there's an officer's briefing room, this very small little room, and to get to you have to actually squeeze past the mast. Now, I was surprised when I actually visited the HMS Surprise in San Antonio, not San Antonio, that's in the middle of that has no ocean near it, in San Diego in California. The HMS Surprise that they have there is a sailing ship, and I was amazed at how many times you had to squeeze past things. You couldn't just walk normally. Now, obviously, I'm also a much bigger person than the average, but there was a lot of squeezing around and shoving around, so I didn't have too much problem with that. But there's also an entrance here from this side that they can get into this very small briefing room. There's a little globe there that they can sort of look at and plot their course and so on. And then in this side room here, I've got, it looks like sort of a merchant, not a merchant, an apothecary or a medical space. That's the sort of the word I was going for, where perhaps a surgeon might sit or a doctor might sit making notes and taking samples. If this is something like the HMS Beagle, which had good old Darwin on board, it might be where he does all of his preserving and his specimen cataloguing and so on. In the front of the ship, again, we've got some water storage being very important, both in space and at sea. Where are you going to get water from? You can't just make it out of thin air, so you have to take it with you, and that takes up valuable space. And of course, cargo is important. And then the front of the ship, we've got the capstan here, which now I realize, and I can do it. Haha, this is what I like about I don't want to shrink it. I want to rotate it so you can actually see that it's off center there, so it's not sitting so much on the line. We've got the capstan, which will lower or raise that anchor. Now, the anchors are usually at the front, and they're sometimes at the back, depending on how big the ship is, but usually one at the front is fine. It might have two anchors, in which case, well, you just put in a second one. But generally speaking, that's where the anchor is going to get lowered. Now, it's important to have this here on the ship for multiple reasons, apart from actually just stopping the ship. But the other thing, the other angle, is that often those chains, which I've used manacles to make them look like chains, but to have those chains there, is those are usually points of entry. Now, when you're trying to get on board a ship, especially a wooden sailing ship, there's many ways of getting onto that ship without being seen, because of the curvature of the ship, as well as the fact that you had basically holes where the anchor chains used to come out of. As we go down into the all-up deck, into the lower deck, where the guns are, you'll see that there's got to be holes for the guns to stick out of, otherwise they're pretty useless having them. So all of these access points are things for you to remember. Now, something that is important, and I feel something that you have to add in, even if the deck plans of sailing ships wouldn't have had it in, is if someone is going to sneak into this room. I don't like the idea that they're going to sneak into this room and it's going to be full of people as well. Maybe there's one person coiling up ropes and something like that, but I purposefully put this door here so that people could sneak into this room, gather their wits about them, sneak through this door, and then move forward. So I put in a lot more doors than they normally would have been. Sometimes it would have just been archways and that sort of thing. So that was a conscious decision to do that. And of course, we've got stairs going straight down into the actual part, the center of the ship. These stairs going down, by the way, are not on the actual weather deck themselves. They don't have giant holes in the top of the deck leading into the center of the ship, for good reason. Those holes are protected by walls, and we are very grateful that that is the case. Now, because this is a military warship, I have put a cage here with a person suffering in it. They didn't kick them off the ship. They're using them as an example. I believe that it is important to throw in these little extra features just to give the ship a little bit more character, not just run-of-the-mill. What I do particularly like about DungeonFog is that if the players were to take over the ship, perhaps they start on the ship as prisoners, perhaps the ship takes over their own vessel, and ultimately your purpose is to allow them to take over the ship, they can come in here, and because it is DungeonFog, we can go in and we can delete. Oh, they don't want it as a bathroom anymore? Nope, take it out. They want to put another bed in there? Absolutely, they get rid of the cage. However we want to do it, we have that flexibility because of using DungeonFog. All right, let's go down. Let's go down, down, down. Now, this is the actual deck that is at the waterline. So that's why I put the waterline in here. You can see she's breaking water as she's cutting through the waves. And there's our Kraken in glorious color. Now, obviously, the Kraken is just there for flavor and detail and to make things look pretty. And because who doesn't like a good Kraken from now, every now and again. We're now in the actual gun deck of the ship. And this is where we have to take into consideration practicalities once again. Generally speaking, crew in a sailing ship in this time period, they would have strung up hammocks here across the central part of the deck, which is where they would have slept. They would have literally slept in the same space that they're firing all of their cannons from, or possibly in another room. So here I've got this little holding room here. It's got a chest in it. It's got some drawers in it. I thought maybe the crew could have a nice space there. Again, generally speaking, the comfort of the individuals, of the sailors in particular, of the non-commissioned officers, was minimal. You had a hammock, you didn't really have a change of clothes unless you were really fancy, and maybe you had a storage locker if you were really, really, really lucky. On a spaceship, it comes at a premium. Space is a premium in space. Now, if you want to have a look at that, head on over to the video of the HMS Midway, which I visited also while I was in San Diego. San Diego's got lots of ships in its harbor. It's wonderful, wonderful harbor. And there you'll see that even on this titanic vessel, pun intended, on this massive vessel, the accommodation for the non-commissioned officers was small. It was minuscule. There was very little personal space, even on that gigantic ship. So space is always at a premium. We've got some more storage stuff in here. We've got a little kitchen, a galley in there. And this, to me, is the importance of kind of going through all of the subcategories that DungeonFog has in it, from your fantasy to Victorian to modern, and just picking and choosing stuff that you need so that you can then put it into, bring the space to life and differentiate it as well from the other areas. Here we've got a bundle full of cloth and a chest. That's probably where the individual who's responsible for keeping the sails all in one piece would sit, quietly stitching away. Again, by dropping in one or two little rooms that actually come from naval vessels, or that you would actually encounter on a real sailing ship or on a real starship or a real modern day warship, it makes the space feel real. And so that when they open the door dramatically and they look up and they see this little old man with a needle busy threading through the sails, it really makes the experience a lot more visceral for your players, which is ultimately what we're looking to do. Now, at the back here, generally speaking, the magazine, which is not the glossy pages of how to attract a man in 50 different ways and to find the ultimate spot. It's not that kind of magazine. It's the weapons magazine. That means it's full of gunpowder, full of explosive stuff. Now, even if this was a fantasy ship and it was firing, it was ballistas here, or catapults, or trebuchets, if you can figure out how to put those onto a ship, you would still have somewhere where all of the weaponry is stored. It wouldn't be just left lying around. For several reasons. Oftentimes, if the ship was a pirate ship, you had a bunch of murderers all in the same space. You don't want to give them easy access to massive amounts of weaponry or firepower. You want to control that very, very carefully. But also, because this section of the ship is very close to the waterline, it makes it a little bit more difficult to hit, or if you do hit it, to actually achieve impact with cannonballs. The magazine here is actually too high. It should be one deck lower, under the waterline, because the cannonball obviously loses a lot of velocity when it hits the water, and so it's not likely to puncture in there and cause the whole thing to explode. That's true all the way even today on modern vessels. If the magazine is hit, the entire ship is likely to blow up. We don't want that, do we? So we've got the magazine on either side here. One is for weaponry, the other one is for actual gunpowder and so on. And then right at the back here, we've got another little cabin This cabin, almost as big as the captain's cabin above it, I thought would be the first officer's cabin. So they can control the magazine and that kind of thing, or the gunner's control, so they can control the gun deck and that sort of thing. So generally speaking, again, the center of the deck now is where I kept it as clean as possible, so we could have some nice character battles going on here. Well, because the cannons are on the sides, and they have to be, but also I could have put cargo here. I didn't want to do that. Notice the hatches now from above would lead down basically to this midsection. I hope you can see where my mouse is on the map. And then you then manually haul it into these two, which will take us into our very lowest and last deck, which happens to be the hold. Now the hold is very dark, and I purposefully did this way because it is underwater. This is the part that's underwater, and if you notice, it's also smaller and slightly of different shape. The hull of the vessel tapers downwards so that it can cut through the water. Starships don't necessarily have this requirement, although for some unknown reason we still design them in that way, which is an interesting one. Nonetheless, they generally get smaller as they go down, and so here we find ourselves in the deepest, darkest bowels of the ship. So crates and things will be lowered down into the central area. You can see here I've just loaded it up with crates and boxes. And when I'm working with DungeonFog, I consciously make sure that I don't just use the same box. And if I do, I rotate it so that it doesn't look like it's the same. And then I try and just find every single crate, container, box, chest that I can to really mix it up so that it gets quite a nice differentiator. I've purposely built it in a circular shape, so that if characters run in from here, they can sneak around this way whilst the guard walks around the bottom of the circle. They can do all of those kinds of wonderful theatrical cinematic moments that allows them to actually succeed in their goal rather than to get trapped in their goal. Now, importantly here, I've got two sneaky rooms. That's by the red indicator, which I love in DungeonFog. It allows you to say, well, this door is trapped. This door is locked, this door requires a key, etc., etc. And then it highlights it for you, and you can export a version for your players which does not highlight, so they don't necessarily see it sticking out. So I've got these two false rooms, and then in the prison down here, because I thought you have to have a prison on a ship. You've always got to have some way, you've got to have a brig, right? Throw him in the brig, because that's something that we like to shout often. You've got the brig officer's room. Now, he actually has quite a lot of space here. He's almost got as much space as the captain does. But well, that's the benefit of being underwater in a sailing ship where you don't get to see the light of day, and all of the smells. Oh, it's just nasty down there. Absolutely nasty. Now, there's two prison cells here, and there's one that's got bones in it. The reason why it's got bones in it is because when they bring people into the prison, they can see that you're likely to rot here. But more importantly, there's another secret compartment in there. I thought, what better place to hide a secret compartment than in a prison cell? No one's going to look inside a prison cell for a secret compartment, surely. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. This one is concealed, even though it's not red because it's not trapped. Oh, it's not concealed. Sorry, I obviously didn't click on the tab. Again, there we go. So now it's gone red. Okay, so now it's concealed. Fantastic. And of course, bars block the way there. Stairs up there, stairs down there. The back here, we've got another little office for perhaps this could be where the surgeon, oh, not the surgeon because he's already got a room. This could be a private study, a quiet space. I've got one room here, this other funny little wedge space. Again, that could be for more storage. Then there's a little room here, which originally was going to be the magazine because it's underwater, but it just got too small and I ran out of space. And then finally, right at the back is the treasure room where they've put all of their wonderful treasure. They're not going to put it very much higher up on the ship because if it gets hit by a cannonball, you've lost all of your income for very little return. So by putting it below the waterline, it's less likely to get attacked, damaged, and destroyed. Now, there's lots of things that have been left out of this ship. Mechanical things, how the steering columns work, all those kinds of things. But I don't think it's necessary to keep those in. You have to have a figurehead, remember. You must always have a figurehead. Don't forget to have a figurehead. Those are critical to making sure that your ship actually works. We all know that to be an absolute truth. So something to bear in mind there. Anyway, that is my take on pirate ships and how you should design them, or at least keep in mind a way of designing them so that you can create these amazing, amazing adventures. Until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of map making.